In this video, we're going to show you to install the water pump and timing belt on your Toyota Camry located on the front side of your engine. Use a 12mm wrench to loosen the bolt on the terminal. Go ahead and give that a wiggle, pull it up and set it aside. Now we have the battery disconnected. We want to come over here to the top of the alternator and we want to remove this cap. We want to loosen this 10mm nut and remove it. Pull off that wire and I'm going to reinstall that 10mm nut. I'm going to come on over here to this connector and we want to separate this from our alternator. So on the top is a little tab you're going to push in on and pull this out of the back side. And just kind of flop that off to the back side over there. Remove our alternator. Come on to the back bolt here. That is a 14mm. I'm going to loosen that bolt. You can leave it in for now, but we're going to go ahead and just remove it. It does have to get removed anyways. So we're going to pull that bolt out and set that aside. We're going to loosen the back bolt here. This is a 12mm. I'm just going to spin that right out, remove it. The other thing we're going to want to do is before this bolt is all the way out, we want to go ahead and loosen this bolt here. This is the tensioner, so this is going to allow the alternator to drop down, allowing us to go ahead and set that belt tension on our reassembly. So I'm going to switch over to power tool, loosen this, and you can watch the alternator drop. This is a 12mm. Remove that back bolt. Pull off the belt. Now at this point here, we should be able to wiggle our alternator right out. Now if you're having an issue getting it out, you can use a pry bar between the bracket and the alternator itself and just kind of pop that out. But in most cases, you can wiggle this out like this. Ours is not a most case. Go ahead and grab that pry bar. Pry it out and remove the alternator. It's always a safe bet to go ahead and take the bolt that you removed and throw that back into the alternator with the washers. Remove your serpentine belt. Once you have the belt out, you can come on up to the expansion tank right here. And this is usually held into this bracket here. Just kind of give this a little wiggle, pop that up. We'll set that off to the side like so. Now if you have a lot of coolant in this here, you want to be careful where you set it up. Make sure it doesn't spill out. On our torque strut here, I want to go ahead and loosen and remove this 14mm bolt. Now the motor may shift a little bit. That is totally okay. In order for you to remove the bolt, you might have to kind of grab that engine, just kind of wiggle it a little bit, pop that bolt out. On the back side of the torque strut here, there are two 14mm bolts here. I want to loosen and remove these. ahead and grab that bracket and torque strut, wiggle that out. I'm going to go ahead and throw these bolts back in here. As well as this upper one here. I want to go ahead and remove this bracket right here, the whole alternator bracket that comes across to the front to the torque strut bracket. Now I want to start here. Here is one of the engine hooks here in case it needs to be lifted. There is a 14mm bolt here with a ground strap on it. That needs to get popped off first. I am going to put that bolt back in. And once that bolt is in, we're going to go ahead and just pull that ground strap back. Tuck that off on the side. I'm going to remove these 3 bolts, 14mm. As you come around to the front side of the bracket, there's another bolt here, and there's a couple down below here. You gotta loosen and remove this upper bolt, 14mm. Get rid of this bracket, set that aside. Use our 14mm gear wrench on these lower bolts. And at this point here, the bracket is free, but the bolts are too long right there to kind of pop them out. So just kind of pivot the bracket, swing it around with the bolts still in it, and go ahead and set that aside. We're going to remove our upper timing cover here. There's a series of 10mm bolts around the perimeter. There's 3 here, and there's a couple on the back side. Now these timing covers, if you have a higher mileage vehicle, they can be super fragile. So be prepared to replace these if you find them cracked. Like here, this may have been over tightened or could be just be brittle from years of age. But if they are damaged, it is highly recommended that you replace these covers with some new equipment. Now on the back side of our upper timing cover, we have an upper bolt here, and then there's one down below. We're going to use a shallow 10mm in our ratchet. Take your time. Make sure you exercise patience because This is a tight spot and you don't want to break any of the plastic or the hoses running through here. I'm going to switch over to a gear wrench for clearance purposes. Go ahead and remove that lower bolt. Now on the top side here, we want to go ahead and pull our #1 spark plug wire. Pull that up and out. We're going to use a 5/8 spark plug socket and extension. We want to go ahead and loosen and we want to remove this spark plug. Now the spark plug sockets normally have a little rubber boot inside. They'll capture the spark plug, allowing you to pull it up and out like so. And then you'll have to pull it out, set that aside. Go ahead and grab that timing cover and just work that out, set that aside. Go ahead and use a pry tool to go ahead and pop off your center cap. Use a 21mm socket to go ahead, loosen and remove the lug nuts. Go ahead and grab your wheel and remove that, set it aside. With the wheel off, you're going to see two 10mm bolts here. I'm going to go ahead and loosen and remove those. With those bolts loose, we can remove this fender inner liner. Now through the wheel well area here, you're going to look at your power steering, pump and pulley. We have to remove this belt. In order to do so, we have our 12mm gear wrench on the upper bolt. I want to go ahead and loosen this. Now we don't have to remove this, we just need to loosen it. Then we're going to go ahead, we're going to move down behind the pulley. It's in the back side here. We're going to show you the slotted area and the bolt we need to loosen next. Using a 12mm socket and extension, we're going to go to the bolt here. You can see the slot right there. And all we have to do is loosen this. I'm going to grab this belt and just give it a tug. You can see we loosened it. You can see that the slot has moved. Go ahead and work that belt off and pull it off. Remove it, set it aside. Now through the wheel well, we're going to access the 19mm bolt on our crankshaft here. We're going to use our 1/2" ratchet, socket, and extension. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and slowly rotate this here clockwise. And as we rotate this here, the pulley and belt on the top side are going to be rotating. Now I have a long 1/4" extension here. You can use a long screwdriver or a thin metal rod if you want. And what we're going to do is drop this down gently inside the cylinder. And you're going to feel it bottom out. As we go ahead and crank the crankshaft down below here, we're going to watch that belt turn and we're going to watch that extension come up. Now the next step we have to do is on the upper camshaft pulley here, there's going to be one of these teeth that has a groove or a notch in it. Now we need to focus and locate that. right here, we can actually see this tooth right here has that notch in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a crayon here. I'm going to go ahead and mark this. So there's 3 points we're going to be paying attention to. This mark here, we're going to be paying attention to as this comes around, we want to note where the position of this is. So we want this to be top dead center. So the piston is down inside, and as it comes up, this is going to rise up. Now we want to get this to line up. We want to get this at the very top. And then down below on our harmonic balancer, we have a notch on our harmonic balancer that's going to be coming around, and it's going to line up with the 0 on the lower timing cover. So these 3 things need to be lined up. Now, if they don't line up, you're going to continue to rotate the engine another 360 degrees. And at that point there, all 3 of these here should line up. Let's go ahead and do this. So at this point, we have our extension at top dead center. It was just starting to go down, so we backed it up just a tiny bit. We lined up this upper at 12 o'clock. And then down below, we have the little notch in our harmonic balancer lining up with 0. You can actually mark that, but there is a little notch there. Now with everything lined up, I'm now going to take the crayon and I'm going to mark the belt. I'm going to mark it there. It lines up with that gear that has the notch in it, as well as I'm going to mark the belt here right where it meets on the edge of the cover. Now that we have our belt marked, we're going to go ahead and raise the vehicle and remove our harmonic balancer. Now once we have the belt marked up top, I want to go ahead and mark our harmonic balancer as well. It doesn't have to be in a particular location here, but when we go ahead and loosen and remove this bolt here, I want to make sure that our harmonic balancer doesn't move from where it's at. So we can mark here, mark the cover, and mark the back side of the pulley. Let's go ahead, loosen and remove that bolt. I'm gonna use our 19mm socket on here. Now, the pulley had rotated just a tiny bit. And if you want to, you can thread the bolt back in. Now, it's not gonna be super tight, so you don't have to worry about it moving under impact pressure. Just going to rotate that back just a tiny bit. Then we can go ahead and loosen that again just by hand like that. Now we're using a puller tool here to go ahead and pull our harmonic balancer here. Let's go ahead and work on pulling this. There we go. Again, remove that harmonic balancer. On our lower cover, we have 4 10mm bolts holding that on. We're gonna go right up inside the frame here and get that center one out first. Now we switch over to a 1/4" ratchet. It helps with clearance purposes in there. And then we just have 3 around the outer perimeter. All right, go ahead and set those bolts aside. Go ahead and grab that cover. We want to work this off. You want to be careful not to break the cover. Ours has a couple broken tabs on there. Now, if you're going to be reusing the timing belt itself, you can go ahead and mark this. Now, we're going to come on down here first, and we're going to remove this little shield. It is keyed, so it slips over the key on the crankshaft. Now, go ahead and take your crayon, and I'm going to mark a reference point here on the belt and this lower pulley. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little arrow on the belt. That tells me that that belt is going to be routed that way there. That's going to be marked here. When we put this back on, we'll make sure that everything lines up with these here. In most cases, it's not critical because as long as you have the crank and the cam lined up, you're going to be good to go. But it's always good if you're going to be using that belt, it makes it easier for you to reinstall. Now on the belt itself, I put cam for the camshaft pulley. I just wrote that in. It's not necessary because we marked the bottom of the belt as well. I just like to take all precautions necessary if you're going to be reusing this belt. Now down below here we have a spring. This is the tensioner spring. We're going to go ahead and remove this spring. I just used a pick to go ahead and pop that off. Unhook it off of the tensioner. Set that aside. On the tensioner pulley here, we're going to go ahead and use a 14mm socket. Loosen that. Then just release the tension on the belt itself. I'm going to go ahead and pop this right off. Pull that bolt. Okay, pull that tensioner off. I'm just going to throw the bolt back in here. I'm going to set this aside. Go ahead and remove your belt. Now I'm going to loosen and remove this bolt here for the idler pulley. Using a 14mm socket to remove the bolt for that idler pulley. Okay, get that bolt loose and pull the whole idler right out. Set that aside. Now the next thing you want to do is go ahead, we're going to drain the coolant And how we're going to do that is we're going to remove these two 10mm nuts on the back of this bypass tube here. We can also remove the clamp on our thermostat housing right here for the low radiator hose. Now we have a catch can underneath to catch this coolant. Yes, you could do this before you start the job. However, as long as you have a catch can, it's simple enough to go ahead and do it now. Now just use an open end wrench. You can use a box wrench if you want. It's too tight to fit a socket in there with a ratchet. I remove the upper nut. Okay, get that lower nut removed. Go ahead and set those two aside. Now that we have the two nuts removed off of the bypass studs here, we want to go ahead and loosen and remove the two nuts on the thermostat housing. Those are a 10mm. Now remember, you have your catch can underneath. Now with those two nuts removed, we're gently going to go ahead and move that thermostat housing let that coolant drain down into your catch can. Move the thermostat in the housing and just kind of pop that off to the side. Remove this 12mm bolt for this bracket. This is the tensioner bracket for your alternator. We're going to go ahead and use our 10mm socket and remove the bolts securing the water pump. I just removed 5 bolts. Now we're probably going to lose a little bit more coolant here, so you may want to reposition your catch can. Now as you're moving this around, we're going to be separating the water pump housing from the bypass tube in the back there. Pop that off. There is a gasket on the back side here, so you want to pay attention to that. So here we have the water pump and the water pump housing. We need to go ahead and separate these two. Let's go ahead and do that. Remove your bypass tube gasket here. I'm going to flip this over. And on the water pump side, there's a Phillips head screw. Loosen that screw and remove it. Separate the water pump from the housing. There's a gasket here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Before reassembling the components, you want to go ahead and clean the surface here. Let's go ahead and work on that. Now on our surface here, this is made out of aluminum, so you want to make sure that you're not going to be using razor blades and things like that that can gouge or chip the aluminum. So first thing we're going to do, give this a spray down. Then we're going to use some 400 grit sandpaper on a block of wood. Now this is a flat piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm gently going to just run across the aluminum here. And what I'm doing is making sure that I'm giving it an even surface. We don't want to warp this. We're not taking away aluminum chunks or anything. We just want to clean off any of the old gasket that might be there causing a possible sealing problem down the road. Give this a spray down, clean everything out, wipe it down. Now if you have compressed air, you can go ahead and blow this out. If not, do your best you can with your spray. I'm going to flip this over, and we want to do the same in this area here, just kind of do an inspection of the surface. And you're going to do the same with that block of wood, just kind of get in there and clean up that surface a little bit. And just continue to do that so you have a good surface there. Wipe it down. Inspect the coolant bypass ports. And then we have this port here we want to also clean. You're going to take your housing here, install the gasket, line up the water pump. install the Phillips head screw here. Take your bolts and go ahead and get these started. Tighten down that Phillips head screw. I'm going to go ahead and run these bolts down. Now we're not going to tighten these yet until we get the whole component installed, and then we'll go through and do a final torquing on all those bolts. Before installing, remove the old gaskets. On the bypass tube, the upper one, there is an O-ring. Use a pick, remove that. You can cut it off if you want, but remove that O-ring, dispose of that. I want to clean this up as much as possible. Wipe off all the portions where the new gaskets are going to go. On the engine block side here, we're simply going to use a razor blade to clean that. Now, because this is cast, we can get away with using a razor blade. Just hold the blade at an angle. And go ahead and clean up any of the old debris that's stuck on there. Clean up that surface, make sure it is ready for a new gasket. Install an O-ring on the upper coolant bypass tube. Push that back and make sure it falls into the groove completely. Now take your water pump and housing assembly, and I'm going to use a tiny little dab of RTV, just a little spot there and a tiny little spot there. And the purpose of that is we need to install this O-ring here. Now we're going to be holding this sideways. We don't want this O-ring to fall out. So I'm simply just putting a tiny dab there to hold that so it doesn't fall out while we hold it sideways. Do not coat this in RTV. Install the bypass tube gasket here. I'm going to go ahead and get ready to install this unit. Now, a little tip here, we're going to spray this O-ring here with some spray solvent. This will help the water pump housing slide right over that nice and easy. So give this a quick spray. Line this up. All right, our water pump O-ring is seated on the back side. I'm going to take 2 bolts, and on either side here for the water pump, right where that O-ring was placed, I'm going to get these bolts started in here. I'm going to take this bolt here, feed that up here, and get that threaded in. I want to torque these bolts to 82 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, but inch-pounds. And you're going to start at the top one. You're going to go underneath the water port and do the bottom one, and then come up and end number 3 on this one here. Then we're going to go around to the other bolts, and we can just torque those down normally to 82 inch-pounds as well. All right, those 3 are done. Then go ahead and just double check that Phillips head screw on the top. Nice and tight. Install the 2 nuts on the bypass tube on the back side here. And these here, you basically want to make them snug. Once you tighten down that lower nut, come back to the upper one, and we're just gonna do this a couple times to make sure that everything is seated properly. Now, if you have the ability to do so, you want to go ahead and torque these to 78 inch-pounds. That is not a lot, so that's why we're just going to use our wrench on this here to snug those down. On your thermostat housing, we want to go ahead and replace the gasket itself. Now, I'm going to pay attention specifically on how this thermostat is placed in here. I'm just going to put a little etch mark here. Now's a prime time to go ahead and replace the thermostat if you want to. I'm going to use my pick and roll this gasket off. Take your new gasket, and it fits right around inside the groove. So just work that around. And take your thermostat and slide that back in. Now what I'm doing here is I'm lining up this brace here with the line I put here. We have the bleeder port at roughly 12 o'clock. I want to go ahead and line this up. Slide that into place. Push that on. Get those nuts installed. And just gently snug those down. Once they're bottomed out, just give it a little bit more. I'm going to come back to the upper one, double check that one. Install the lower idler pulley. I'll go ahead and snug that down gently. Give that pulley a spin, make sure it's not binding up at all. Take your tensioner, push that onto the guide pin right here, the pivot pin. Go ahead and get that bolt started in there. Now we're going to thread that bolt in. We're not going to tighten it, we just want to make sure that this does pivot. Let's go ahead and get our spring. Now what you want to do is take the new springs that are supplied. There's two of them. One is shorter and they have different hooks on them. Take the original one, match it up, and use the new one supplied. You can dispose of the other one. Take a new spring, hook that down below, and set that on the top. You're going to push down gently, just enough to hold the spring in place. Now that we have our spring set here, what we want to do is press down on the tensioner pulley here, push it down, and then tighten this bolt. Now we're going to use a pry bar here and just gently set up against the upper cam gear. I'm going to push that down. And just gently snug down that bolt. It doesn't have to be super tight. We just want to hold the tension on the spring all the way down. Go ahead and drop your timing belt down. Going to run our belt around our cam. It's going to go down around. Now we have the belt around the cam, it's around our tensioner, around the water pump, around our idler. Now I want to go into the wheel well area and wrap it around the two lower pulleys. I want to go ahead and stretch that belt a little bit. Get that put onto our crank. Now I'm going to reach up and I'm going to loosen the bolt on the tensioner, and that spring will take up the slack. It's going to retract. So we're just going to do that just a little bit. And when we do that, you can watch the slack be taken up on the belt. There's the tension on the belt. Give that a wiggle. Make sure it's on all of your pulleys. And we're just going to snug that back in place, and then we'll come back afterwards and torque that down. Now we'll back up top after we just snugged our tensioner bolt right here. Now you always want to do this here. Do not skip this step. Come back up top, loosen this bolt again. Now you want to go ahead underneath this and pull up. You want to make sure that if there's any slack here, that this comes up any further. While holding it, then go ahead and snug that down. Make sure you perform this step. Torque your lower idler pulley to 31 foot-pounds. Now down below, install your crank bolt. And the reason why we're going to do this here is we're going to manually crank over the engine. And the purpose of this here is we're going to go ahead and watch the marks. We have our mark on our cam, and then we have our crayon mark down on our crank. And we're going to rotate this 3 times. And what we want to do is make sure that when this comes around, everything lines up again as it should. That'll confirm that we have the belt tightened in the correct location and everything else is in sync. Now here we have our yellow mark. It's matching up with our mark here. We're going to check the bottom and make sure that our crank is lined up as well. Remove the crank bolt. Once we remove that bolt, we can now go ahead and install the lower washer. This has a keyway in it that will line up with the key on the crank. I usually put that on and then rotate it so that the key keeps that from coming off. Now that we've run everything through its cycle, I'm going to go ahead and just loosen this tensioner one more time. Pull up on that, make sure it's nice and tight. Hold it, snug it. Let's go ahead and torque that down to 31 foot-pounds. Install your timing cover. go ahead and gently snug down those 4 bolts. Once it bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. It's just a plastic cover we're holding in place, so you don't want to over tighten these. Now, when we removed our crank here, we had our puller set on. I'm just going to wobble this on just a tiny bit. I'm going to go ahead and crank this back. I want to get my line to line up as close as possible. This yellow mark here. Now, obviously, on the top side, we have our mark here that's going to line up with the 0 on the upper timing cover. So now we're pretty much set up where we were before. Let's go ahead and remove our lower timing cover next. Take the harmonic balancer. You want to line up the notch with the key. Make sure that the key is still in the crankshaft here. Gonna line that up. Install the bolt. We're going to go ahead and tighten down our harmonic balancer bolt here. Now, normally there's a tool to hold the harmonic balancer in place while we torque this. You would want to torque it to 80 foot-pounds. In our case, we're just going to use our impact gun because we don't have this tool. Install your power steering belt. Going to go around the back side of the harmonic balancer and then around the pulley here. Now, with the belt installed, take your pry bar, go up underneath, and you're going to push on this tab right here, and you're going to tighten this belt. Now, you want just a little bit of slop in that, so you're going to put some pressure on that. Tighten this down here. Now, we do have to tighten the bolt up top as well. Let's go ahead and check that tension. It is perfect. It's about a 1/2 inch play back and forth. We'll put our wrench up on the top to the upper bolt for the power steering pump. And we want to snug this down too. Make sure that's good and snug. Once you have that one tight, we just want to double check the lower bolt as well while we're here. So we're just going to put that up inside and just snug that. Double check the tension. And that is perfect. Install our bracket here for the alternator. Install the bolt for this portion of the lower cover. Gently snug that. Install the upper cover. get our lower back bolt in. And we'll go ahead and snug down our upper bolts here. Go ahead and feed our bracket down inside. Now we have the 2 bolts installed on this. Okay. Now to get these bolts started, I was able to run my arm around the back side of the strut tower to get that rear one going. Now I'll come around to the front. Now I want to go ahead and install our bracket here. This is for our alternator. Leaving this bracket loose here, this will allow us to go ahead and get everything lined up as needed. Now that we have these 3 bolts for this bracket in, we now take the horizontal bolt for this bracket and it goes through into the alternator bracket. Now at this point, we have these 3 bolts, this horizontal bolt, and the 2 horizontal bolts for this front bracket all need to get tightened. Now once we have those tight, you can bring your ground wire up and over. Install it onto that bracket there. You can put it behind it if you want, like so. And tighten that down. Install your alternator. Want to bring the wires and everything over. And I'm going to drop the top portion or the pivot portion into the bracket. And just threading that bolt through. Install that bolt through the back side. Go ahead and drop our serpentine belt down. We're going to feed that down onto the front part of the crankshaft pulley and then around our AC. Bring it up and pop that on there. Make sure the belt is on all of the pulleys all the way. I want roughly a 1/2 inch either way. That's perfect for tension on there. Let's go ahead and tighten down the back bolt here and then the rear horizontal bolt here. You want to go ahead and snug this, not super tight, but make sure it's snug. Check that belt tension again. And then we'll go ahead and tighten down the back pivot bolt. Remove the nut on the top of the alternator. You want to make sure that you get your clip on here. Feed that down. Snug this. Once you feel it bottom out, just give it a little bit more. Slide the protective cover over, lock that on, and then install the connector on the back side. I'm going to remove our hardware that we had placed here temporarily. I'm going to run those down a little bit, keep them loose. Get this bolt started. Now we can go ahead and tighten down all three. Before we install the spark plug, let's go ahead and remove our extension. Now at this point here, we're ready to install our spark plug. We're going to install it into our spark plug socket, and this has a rubber boot inside to secure the spark plug. Lower this down carefully. You want to start threading that in by hand. Never use a power tool when doing something like this here. Once you're confident that that spark plug is threaded in several threads by hand, you can go ahead and run it down the rest of the way with your ratchet. Once you feel that bottom out, you want to stop there. Go ahead and remove the socket and the extension. Go ahead and torque down your spark plug to 13 foot-pounds, and then install your ignition wire, pushing that down and snapping that on. Go ahead and install your reservoir. Make sure that the pin on the bottom lines up with the grommet on the inside of the fender liner there. Slide that down into place. Install your splash guard here. Make sure that's snug. Do the same for this one. Go ahead and grab your wheel. Get that lined up. Pop that on. Let's go ahead and install our lug nuts. I'll go ahead and get all these started by hand first. Once these are all on, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Now we want to go ahead and torque down our lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. I'm going to do this in a star pattern. Once you have the lug nuts torqued, go ahead and line up your cap here. Install the ground terminal, twist that down. Going to tighten down the nut. Now once this nut bottoms out, you want to give it a little bit more. You want to make sure it's good and snug, but you don't want to over tighten it. You can damage the terminal end if you over tighten it. So snug that down. Give this a wiggle, make sure it doesn't twist on that post. If it does twist, go ahead and tighten this down a little bit more and then check it again. Ours is good. Using the appropriate coolant, go ahead and fill up that tank. Install the hose and snap the cap on. At that point there, you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.